Okay, hi, I'm Sandra Brown. I'm here to talk to you about how to dye wool for the fine cut hooking that we like to do, especially with flowers. And this is a follow-up video to the Rug Hooking Magazine September-October issue of 2013. And we're going to start with a piece of white wool that has been soaking in Synthrapol for at least an hour. I think it's good to pre-soak the wool for some period of time. It's going to accept the dyes more easily. And I'm going to lay this in a pan so that it can lay totally flat and there's no wrinkles in it. Now, remember when we decide the length of the wool, we are going with the assumption that it takes 4 to 5 times a length of a piece of wool to fill a given area. So if your area is 5 inches, you are going to need at least a 20-inch piece of wool that when you're painting it like this or doing casserole dyeing, that will be long enough to hook up to fill 5 inches. If it's shorter than that, then you'll do your hooking and your wool will run out before you've finished the motif. So in this case, I have a 15-inch piece of wool because it's basically the one that fits the pan nicely without being wrinkled on either end. And I'm going to start applying the dyes in a what's called a casserole dyeing technique. This was Edna Fleming's book in the early 1960s that talked about how to do this, and I've modified it to use pro-chemical dyes. The one I'll start with is Grasshopper number 719, and basically what I'm going to do is spoon this wool with this Grasshopper color, which is almost a chartreuse green. I'm going to carry it almost up to the top, but not quite. Some people like to use a brush for doing this as well, and that can be used. Personally, I kind of like the spoon because you can pick up from the sides and keep reapplying. And the bottom of the spoon makes a good scoop here to pusher. So I have made these dye solutions up with 1/8 teaspoon of dry dye in 1/2 cup of water. This is what we call your original dye solution, which when you read the article in Rug Hooking Magazine, I call the ODS, the original dye solution. So here we are, just 1/8 of an inch of wool mixed with 1/2 cup of water, and I'm basically spooning this on now. I'm going to light the fire. I'm doing this outside. It's I don't know, it's just easier to film, I think, and I'm going to keep this wool nice and straight. If I had wrinkles in it, you can see where the dye would start to collect in the crevices, and then I wouldn't get a nice even effect. So whatever you do, it has to lay, I find that it works better if it lays flat. I don't want them on too high, because it does take a certain amount of time for it to take up. And these are acid dyes, so that the final setting of the dyes is a combination both of heat and an acid. I tend to prefer citric acid, which I've made up into a solution here, and I'll be putting that on last. So as the heat, as this piece of wool starts to get warmer and warmer, it'll start to take up the dye. And this is my chance to kind of play around with the colors. If I want one side to be a little bit darker, well then I can spread a little bit of dye along that side. Next I'm going to start with saffron, Prochem Saffron number 228, and that's going to go on the top third that hasn't gotten any dye yet. This is a fairly intense dye. So what I'm going to do is, just to be on the safe side, I'm going to take a couple tablespoons of this and mix it with water. So I've diluted the original dye solution, and I'm going to start spreading that yellow along the top. That's top, down the sides. Just keep smushing it in, drying it down. You can see some of it going in the water on the sides, which you can then scoop up and put over the wool. Now this is getting a little warm down here because, and I know that because the wool is starting to bubble. So I'm going to turn it down, hopefully not off, and go back to putting more of this yellow orange color on the top. This is called saffron. It's one of the ProChem premix dyes, which are kind of nice because they've kind of done the work for you. I think I would like that to be a little more yellow. So I'm going to take a couple more tablespoons. A little more water. Well, I'm just going to keep spooning this on here. Remember, when we're dyeing wool, even any kind of wool, you want to go for an effect that's a bit brighter, a bit more colorful, more intense than what you want to end up with, because first of all, the dyes haven't all taken into the wool yet. They haven't. They've just started to. And secondly, in this case, well, in any case, when it dries lighter. So there we have a really pretty kind of green at the bottom. I could stop right here. There's certainly some flowers, leaves, etc. that I would like to be able to hook. Cut the strips this way, start hooking from the green end to the light end, and all my colors would be built in. But we're going to move next to burgundy, and I think this is going to be a little bit intense too, so I'm going to mix this with some water, just to be on the safe side. You can always add, it's like salt, you can always add, you can't take away. 2 tablespoons and a little extra water here. I'm going to run this down the sides, smooshing, moving it back and forth. You see, it's kind of sitting in this water along here, but that's good. On the bottom. Back and forth, up and down. I could easily do it on this side. I think I'll leave it off and just give myself a piece of wool that has red on one side, darker red at the bottom, and going to a nice gold orange at the top. And you can see how the addition of the red, of the burgundy, is affecting the colors that are already there. It's a beautiful orange, rusty up here, coming into a deeper rust red, and down here a more muted red. So I can spoon these wools over, or spoon the dye from the side over if I want. Kind of get a little bit more going in there. I wonder if I turn that guy off. so that is starting to set. And I think I'm going to darken the bottom end just a little bit more. And this I'm going to use mahogany, Prochem Mahogany 508. It's a very intense dye, and it will give me the really dark end I want at the bottom. Generally speaking, we want our wool to be, when we do casserole dyeing, we want the wool to be dark at the bottom, light in the, or medium in the middle, and light at the top. That means that when we're hooking shadow lines and things, we could put the dark end, the dark is already built into our wool. It's not necessary that you would do this. I could put a dark end on that too, for instance. In fact, I could probably put the mahogany on this end and leave this the light and use it for a plum that had a sort of a red, slightly chartreuse highlight. I'm going to keep adding a little bit more here, even make it darker than I think I want it, because in fact I know it's going to dry quite a bit lighter. So I'm spooning and trying to keep this bubbling down. See, that green that we started with is almost gone. In fact, it has turned to something resembling a true chartreuse here in the middle. Okay, now for the last color, and this is when we go across the color wheel. What I've done to begin with is been pretty much stay in one sector of the color wheel. The grasshopper was from here, the saffron was from here, the burgundy was from here, maybe over in this area. But now I'm going to cross over the color, and when we do that, we're reaching for the complementary. And because the wool is hot, it's going to take this dye very quickly now. And I want to make a slightly blue streak running down the middle of this. So this is Blue Spruce 495. No, I'm sorry, Blue Spruce 721. This is Blue Spruce 721. And I am going to run a bead of this down the side here. And start moving it in, slopping us up here. See how that's blending in nicely? We get just a little whisper of another color here, which makes it so much more interesting to work with. Okay. Now, the other reason we do casserole dyeing is we have a, say for instance, we have a rug with a whole bunch of motifs that are the same. I have a rug with 7 daylilies to do, and these are the colors that I want on those daylilies. So I can take for the second piece, same size, lay it right over the top of this one. And repeat the dye that I just did, the whole dye system. In that case, I'll start with the grasshopper again. Not quite up to the top. See how the spoon scoops this out of the way for you? It kind of gives you a chance to move the dye around a bit more, I think, than a brush does. Now the second piece is accepting dye both from what I'm putting on the top and what's coming up from below, the piece below. I want to be sure and put these dyes in the same places that I did before, because I don't want to subvert the dyeing that I just did below it. And I'm trying to get pieces that are somewhat similar, well, but as close in color as I possibly can, actually. If you could also use, I'm using white wool, but I could just as easily be using a colored wool, a pastel, and the late Helen Connolly, who did beautifully dyed flowers, recommended that when you did this you had several different pastels plus white and in your dye solution, so that you could or in your dyeing pot here, so that you could get the darker versions of it that you need for the petals and the flowers that are in the back. Okay, we're going on to saffron. Splash of water. And that goes on the top. Spooning, smooshing, getting this all nicely moved around. Do not, in Edna Fleming's book, Casserole Dye, she recommended, because she was using the old aniline dyes, she recommended putting your vinegar in this cup of dye solution. I do not, absolutely do not do that. It will take too fast into the wool. It won't get into the deep part of the fiber, and you'll end up with something that has a white core, which is the last thing we want. Okay, so I'll put on pretty much all of the saffron. Okay, then we're back to the burgundy again. And I'm spooning that down the side. On the bottom, you could keep adding pieces of wool one right after another here. In fact, you could go up to, 15 to 20 layers of wool if you wanted. It is labor intensive, as you can see. You have to be standing here watching and spooning and redirecting the dyes as the wool is taking them up. But it's one way to get a batch of wool out of one dye pot. And the ones on the bottom will clearly be darker than the ones on the top, the last ones that you do. But again, that's useful for the wool that's at the back of a motif. The back petals on your hooked rug are always a little bit darker. They're supposed to be a little bit darker than the ones in the front. So the front petals, I would use the top pieces of wool. The back petals, I would use the ones that are on the bottom. Okay, I'm going to do the mahogany again on the bottom. Get that really dark end that I want. Whether I use it or not when I'm hooking, it's good to have it, because otherwise then you have to reach for another piece of wool to make those really dark little spots and shadow lines that you need. This time I'm going to go ahead and put in the acid solution on the sides, not on the wool. It'll just create a white streak right down the middle. And then start kind of gently spooning this in over the wool. And it should start setting up faster. See, I can take the spoon and sort of scoop dyes off that I don't want to be there. The other thing we talked about in the article was how this edge of a piece of torn wool takes up so much more dye than, the middle does. And that, a lot of people cut that edge off and throw it away. In the article we talked about how handy they are for showing shadow lines and edges of things. Okay, so I think I'm ready for the blue spruce. You can see the water starting to clear because I've put in the acid. I'll keep that red on that side a little bit. Kind of a spoon and scrape kind of method here to get that dye where I want it. So I have one side that's predominantly red, and then I have the nice blue spruce green coming down the other side here. This will lighten up considerably. You can see how the water is clearing now because the acid that I added is setting the dye. Now if I thought that that was too bright on that end, I might take some of this colored water here and spread it over, toning it down a bit. I don't want the water to completely disappear. Add your water from the side, don't add it on top of the wool because it really, until the dye is completely set, it will create a washout area. Okay, I think I'm going to put just a tiny little bit more of my grasshopper here in the middle. Down here. It's very pretty, the colors that are created where the, a couple of colors meet. Great. So the water is almost cleared. I'm going to let that simmer for a little bit longer. I may just put a tiny bit more mahogany on the bottom here. Like I said, I want a nice dark edge. It's best to, if you're doing this for one project, it really is best to do them all at one time, because it's really difficult trying to replicate things the second time, especially if a few days have passed. Now once the water is cleared, I'll probably, in the pile, especially if the pile were high, I'm going to take this and flip it over so that the other side of the wool pile gets a good heating as well. See how much darker the bottom one is? Now that will dry 2 shades lighter, but and will still be a beautiful piece of wool. The bottom one, the very bottom one, is the one that gets the darkest. As you can see, that's a beautiful piece of wool. Good. Thank you. Okay, so here are our finished pieces of wool. The one on the left is obviously the darker one that was on the bottom, and that's not only going to happen, but it's intentional. we can make really good use of that for the darker side of a motif. Again, the petals, the leaves in the back of the motif are typically darker than the ones in the front, which would be receiving more light and closer to the viewer. Now, interestingly enough, these turned out to be fairly dark because I was using quite a lot of dye. If I had decided I wanted them paler, I would have just maybe cut the amount of dye in half. I would have added more water when I was mixing up the original dye solution, and I would have ended up with a lighter piece of wool. These will dry lighter, at least by 1 if not 2 values, and it's kind of interesting to see that here we were sitting next to this beautiful coleus and almost couldn't have come up with a better match to the colors that are here. I started with 1/8 of a teaspoon of my various dyes in 1/2 cup of boiling water to dissolve the dry dye, and I like to keep all of those dye solutions at the same quantity. So it's either 1/8 of a teaspoon, or it could be 1/16 of a teaspoon if you want to go for a paler piece of wool. But whatever colors you're using, measure out the same amount of dry dye. It's easier to keep records of your dye day if you keep the dye solution equivalent. And of course, now when we are going to use this wool, we're going to cut it into strips the long way, and as we hook, we'll be picking up all of these colors. Now we can also show you how this would work with a daylily. This daylily is a perfect example of what casserole dyeing is really useful for, because we have changes in color, changes in value as you come from the center of the flower out, and we try to build those into the piece of wool. So that, and again, if I was cutting this in strips, I could start with the lighter color in the center and move out, just hook right out to the darker tips. I could use the pieces on the extreme side for the little edges where the petal overlaps the petal behind it.